for all the Aggs who have gone before me,
who gave all they had for all I now enjoy.
Our spirit I faithfully carry forward
and try to leave a better world behind.
Softly call the muster, Aggs,
and raise your candle light.
Gone, but not forgotten.
Let him hear that old farmer's fight.
Today my voice is yours, as I call here.
I stand for fallen heroes,
for those I hold most dear.
Howdy, Aggies. Thank you for joining us for the worldwide Muster Roll Call. Muster is the most sacred of Aggie traditions, reminding us of our love for Texas A&M and commitment to one another. It has been observed around the world during times of prosperity, peace, uncertainty, and conflict. The most famous observance occurred in 1942, when 25 Aggies under siege on the island of Corregidor and unable to physically gather, honored our muster tradition by signing a sheet of paper that was passed from Aggie to Aggie to signify their presence on the island. 78 years later, we too find ourselves unable to physically gather as our world battles COVID-19. We take inspiration, however, from the 1942 Corregidor muster, finding ways to continue our muster tradition globally and locally. We celebrate our bond as members of the Worldwide Aggie Network and remember those who are present only in our hearts. Our 2020 Worldwide Roll Call comes to you from around the world as more than 60 Aggies across the United States, Mexico City, Panama, and El Salvador lead us in calling the names of every Aggie on our worldwide muster roll call. As you join in answering here for your fellow Aggies today, you continue our noble tradition of muster and remind the world that the Aggie spirit will always prevail. Thank you for your undying support of Texas A&M and for each other.
Roll call for the absent by Dr. John Ashton, class of 1906. In many lands and climes this April day, proud sons of Texas A&M unite. Our loyalty to country, school, we pay, and seal our pact with bond of common might. We live again those happy days of yore, on campus, field, in classroom, hall, at drill. Fond memory brings a sigh, but nothing more. Now we are men, and life is one great thrill. On Forster's Isle 78 years ago today, a group of gallant Aggies led by Moore held simple rites which to us all doth say, the spirit shall prevail over the cannon roar. They thought of home and all we hold most dear. Where are they now, those boys we knew so well? Ask of the winds, let smile repress a tear. Think only of their glory when they fell. Corregidor, forevermore a hallowed name to countless sons of Texans yet unborn. Symbolic like it stands for deathless fame, a shrine sublime to a resurrection morn. Softly call the muster, let comrade answer here. Their spirits hover around us as if to bring us cheer. Mark them present in our hearts, we'll meet some other day. There is no death, but life in turn for heroes such as they.
John Walbert Schuchart, class of 1888.
Here.
Marshall Maurice Strauss, class of 1911.
Here.
George Leonard King, class of 1916.
Here.
Colonel Leland Davis Breckinridge, class of 1919.
Here.
William DeVere Frame, class of 1921.
Here.
James Boyd Lampkin, class of 1923.
Here.
Andreas Malatesta Boza, class of 1924.
Here.
Charles Volney Cyrus, class of 1930.
Here.
Samuel A. Ralifs, class of 1930.
Here.
William Graves Terry, class of 1930.
Here.
Joe Lewis Curry, class of 1932.
Here.
Vivian Childers Cyrus, class of 1932.
Here.
Colonel James Elbert Dupree, class of 1932.
Here.
Felix Edwin Gardner, class of 1932.
Here.
Dr. Joe Golanternick, class of 1932.
Here.
J.G. Johnson, Jr., class of 1932.
Here.
James Leonard McGibney, class of 1932.
Here.
Oscar Nelson, class of 1932.
Here.
Vernon C. Pample, class of 1932.
Here.
Richard Simon Center, class of 1932.
Here.
Theodore Thomas Carter, class of 1933.
Here.
Harry Wendell Castle, class of 1933.
Here.
John William Jennings, Jr., class of 1933.
Here.
Naeem E. Kazam, class of 1933.
Here.
Nolan Houston Lockey, class of 1933.
Here.
Tom Clint Morris, class of 1933.
Here.
Robert Leslie Bennett, class of 1934.
Here.
John H. Ratcliffe, class of 1934.
Here.
Robert B. Tobin, class of 1934.
Here.
Dr. Ferris Decker, class of 1935.
Here.
Darwin Bernice Grayson, class of 1935.
Here.
Noble James Taylor, class of 1935.
Here.
Carl E. Maxwell, class of 1936.
Here.
Joseph Weldon Young, class of 1937.
Here.
Andrea Perney Bailey, class of 1938.
Here.
Herbert Coke Cheshire, class of 1938.
Here.
Parker Davy Hanna, Jr., class of 1938.
Here.
Henry Edward Kalina, class of 1938.
Here.
Peggy L. Leeton, class of 1938.
Here.
Shell Edward Newman, class of 1938.
Here.
Terrell Graham, class of 1939.
Here.
Harvey H. Storms, Jr., class of 1939.
Here.
Thomas Adrian Booker, class of 1940.
Here.
Henry Burns Butrell, class of 1940.
Here.
Onus T. Curley, class of 1940.
Here.
James Robert Leeton, class of 1940.
Here.
Layman Newton Robinson, class of 1940.
Here.
Herbert Lindsay Rucker, class of 1940.
Here.
Philip Green Waters, class of 1940.
Here.
William Francis Dickerson, Jr., class of 1941.
Here.
A. Ed Gerlich, class of 1941.
Here.
William King Granville, class of 1941.
Here.
Louis Bob Jaska, class of 1941.
Here.
Julius E. Copit, class of 1941.
Here.
Homer John Moore, Jr., class of 1941.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Lewis R. Morris, class of 1941.
Here.
Eugenio L. Santoni, class of 1941.
Here.
Lee Preston Ward, Jr., class of 1941.
Here.
Wayne D. Alexander, class of 1942.
Here.
Arthur Overman Jr., class of 1942.
Here.
Donald M. Baltz, class of 1942.
Here.
Colonel Brian Cowan, class of 1942.
Here.
Robert Miles Calgo, class of 1942.
Here.
Robert Mackenzie Crane, class of 1942.
Here.
Dr. Lawrence A. DuBose, class of 1942.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Alfred David Gunn, Sr., class of 1942.
Here.
Norman C. Henry, class of 1942.
Here.
Chester Arch Howell, class of 1942.
Here.
Edgar Dullen Ilsner, Sr., class of 1942.
Here.
Clifton Johnson, class of 1942.
Here.
Merle L. Lamb, class of 1942.
Here.
Howard Beverly Lord, class of 1942.
Here.
Robert W. Mansfield, class of 1942.
Here.
James Walter Mandel, class of 1942.
Here.
Francis B. Murray, class of 1942.
Here.
Fred Thomas O'Keefe, class of 1942.
Here.
Eugene Paul Thorne, class of 1942.
Here.
James E. Willingham Jr., class of 1942.
Here.
Colonel V. Doss Wood Jr., class of 1942.
Here.
Jack D. Coryu, class of 1943.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Richard Morrow Elliott, class of 1943. Eddie Sam Hennard, class of 1943.
Here.
Dr. Samuel H. Hoffer, class of 1943. Harry Milton Holcamp, class of 1943.
Here.
Cecil B. Hoyle Jr., class of 1943.
Here.
Arthur Roderick Huss, class of 1943.
Here.
Ralph Francis Lozano, class of 1943.
Here.
Willis Grigsby Mills, class of 1943.
Here.
Robert Lincoln C. Jr., class of 1943.
Here.
Roland B. Von Rader, class of 1943.
Here.
Raymond Herman Wagner, class of 1943.
Here.
William H. Baskin, class of 1944.
Here.
Fred Warren Bondurant Jr., class of 1944. Robert Edward Bush, class of 1944.
Here.
Major William Livingston Butler, class of 1944.
Here.
John Wilbur Fulbright, class of 1944. Dr. Leo Christian Holbrook, class of 1944.
Here.
Robert Lowry Johnson, class of 1944.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Russell Burton Jones, Jr., class of 1944.
Here.
Adolph J. Kolinick, Jr., class of 1944.
Here.
Gerald Glenn Lackey, class of 1944.
Here.
Captain Kenneth Roland Ladenson, class of 1944.
Here.
John Jarvis McCollum, Jr., class of 1944.
Here.
Raymond C. McMurtry, class of 1944.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Lee Powell, Jr., class of 1944.
Here.
Wilfred Taylor Rydell, class of 1944.
Here.
L. Ray Seal, class of 1944.
Here.
Morris Bankler, class of 1945.
Here.
Herbert L. Bramer, class of 1945.
Here.
Arthur Wallace Campbell, Jr., class of 1945.
Here.
Richard Neal Cardwell, class of 1945.
Here.
John Larry Cochran, class of 1945.
Here.
Arthur L. Cockrum, class of 1945.
Here.
Jack Bethay Crawford, class of 1945.
Here.
Lester Ray Fincher, class of 1945.
Here.
William G. Fort, class of 1945.
Here.
Dr. Roger Harold Godwin, Jr., class of 1945.
Here.
George M. Graves, class of 1945.
Here.
Almond Jackson Gray, class of 1945.
Here.
Henry Wildy Harding, class of 1945.
Here.
Howard McNair, class of 1945.
Here.
Peter P.J. Simeon III, class of 2009.
Here.
Mortimer Leonard Mertz, class of 1945. Here. George Barry Pace Jr., class of 1945. Here. Jewel F. Plangman Jr., class of 1945. Here. Charles Max Reese, class of 1945. Here. Colonel Charlie Edward Seaster, class of 1945. Here. Louis Solomon, class of 1945. Here. Deward M. Staton Jr., class of 1945. Here. Frank T. Thompson, class of 1945. Here. James Cleveland Weisinger, class of 1945. Here. Robert Leon Welch, class of 1945. Here. Oscar Marvin Wilkinson Jr., class of 1945. Here. Forrest M. Wilson, class of 1945. Here. William Francis Bumpus, class of 1946. Here. Harry D. Comelette, class of 1946. Here. Gordon Oscar Davis Jr., class of 1946. Here. Alex Dickey III, class of 1946. Here. John Thomas Estes, class of 1946. Here. Raymond Ellis Garlington Jr., class of 1946. Here. Dr. M. Truett Garrett Jr., class of 1946. Here. Dr. William Sledge Houston Jr., class of 1946. Here. Samuel Leroy Jenkins, class of 1946. Here. Harold B. Kelly, class of 1946. Here. J.D. Marks, class of 1946. Here. William Worth Maxwell Sr., class of 1946. Here.
Robert Brantley Mitchell, class of 1946.
Here.
Dr. John Robert Nunn, class of 1946.
Here.
Hubert Paul Richter, class of 1946.
Here.
Dr. Larry Rogers, class of 1946.
Here.
Dr. James Thaddeus Rollins, class of 1946.
Here.
Dr. Rudolph Edward Schiefelbein, class of 1946.
Here.
William Phil Schultz, class of 1946.
Here.
John Thomas Tanzel, class of 1946.
Here.
Brigadier General David Overton Williams, Jr., class of 1946.
Here.
Robert Frank Williams, class of 1946.
Here.
John Pendleton Aycock, Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
Charles P. Baker, Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
Edward M. Cooney, Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
Gerald Marlin Darby, class of 1947.
Here.
Leonard Morris Gabbert, class of 1947.
Here.
Colonel Selden Bain Graham, Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
John Glenn Housel, Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
Charlie Thomas Hildebrand, class of 1947.
Here.
Edwin Dale Hines, class of 1947.
Here.
Malcolm Allen Horton, class of 1947.
Here.
Leland L. Jett, class of 1947.
Here.
Harry Newton Key, Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
James Cecil Kostelnick, class of 1947.
Here.
James Earl Maskin Sr., class of 1947.
Here.
Eugene Decker Manley, class of 1947.
Here.
Duthat Young McDaniel Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
Carl Edwin Olson Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
Leopold de Blanc Pellerin, class of 1947.
Here.
Pete L. Scarmato, class of 1947.
Here.
Bill Maxwell Sawyers, class of 1947.
Here.
Rufus Lee Vickers, Jr., class of 1947.
Here.
James R. Wilson, class of 1947.
Here.
Walter K. Arbuckle, class of 1948.
Here.
Dr. Harry John Auverman, class of 1948.
Here.
Robert Lee Cagle, class of 1948.
Here.
Dr. Stuart Monroe Dobbins, class of 1948.
Here.
Dr. Nelson Mark Duller, Jr., class of 1948.
Here.
Joseph Wesley Featherhoff, Jr., class of 1948.
Here.
Edwin Dick Haynes, class of 1948.
Here.
George Henry J., class of 1948.
Here.
William Levi Johnson, Sr., class of 1948.
Here.
William Edward LaRoche, class of 1948.
Here.
Bobby Legler, class of 1948.
Here.
William Connell Longquist, Jr., class of 1948.
Here.
James Richard Palmer, class of 1948.
Here.
Arthur Neil Potts, class of 1948.
Here.
Richard Franklin Reed, class of 1948.
Here.
Joseph Oscar Scott Jr., class of 1948.
Here.
Charles R. Stone, class of 1948.
Here.
Charles W. Tate Jr., class of 1948.
Here.
Jerry Macklin Zuber, class of 1948.
Here.
Roger K. Adams, class of 1949.
Here.
Roger R. Bradford, class of 1949.
Here.
Judge Ted Butler, class of 1949.
Here.
Dr. Ewart G. Carney, class of 1949.
Here.
Koa Drake Cook, class of 1949.
Here.
William C. Corwin, class of 1949.
Here.
Colonel David Oliver Cravey, class of 1949.
Here.
Charles B. Drake Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
Frank Hebner Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
Curtis O. Higgs, class of 1949.
Here.
Bernd Hirsch, class of 1949.
Here.
John Taylor Hutchin Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
Ernest Werner Kirkheimer, class of 1949.
Here.
Dr. Reuben Earl Koenig, class of 1949.
Here.
Harold S. Leach, class of 1949.
Here.
George Albert Lyle, class of 1949.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James Abbott McCulley, class of 1949.
Here.
Colonel James Turner Moore, class of 1949.
Here.
Colonel James Harvey Morris III, class of 1949.
Here.
Dr. Wendell Herman Niederman, class of 1949.
Here.
Alan Clark Norton, class of 1949.
Here.
Albert Samuel Peterson, class of 1949.
Here.
Horace Frank Simpson, class of 1949.
Here.
James Henley Simpson, Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
David Marion Smith, class of 1949.
Here.
Alvin Reese Sutton, Sr., class of 1949.
Here.
Joe Mack Swindle, class of 1949.
Here.
Joe Donald Vaughn, class of 1949.
Here.
Arnold M. Walco, class of 1949.
Here.
Walter Lazenby Williams, class of 1949.
Here.
Samuel Franklin Wilson, class of 1949.
Here.
Gordon W. Zahn, class of 1949.
Here.
Dr. Kenneth P. Adams, class of 1950.
Here.
Billy Campbell Atchison, class of 1950.
Here.
Robert B. Atkins, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Jack Wallace Baker, class of 1950.
Here.
Stanley Earl Beck, class of 1950.
Here.
Virgil O. Bohack, class of 1950.
Here.
Robert Cox Brenner, class of 1950.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel John H. Burchell, class of 1950.
Here.
Robert Arthur Carlson, class of 1950.
Here.
Arthur William Katanik, class of 1950.
Here.
Dr. Andrew Jackson Cotton, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Chester Calvin Critchfield, class of 1950.
Here.
Joe De Leon, class of 1950.
Here.
Father James J. Dempsey, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Colonel Earl Dean Downing, class of 1950.
Here.
Robert Eldridge Ferguson, class of 1950.
Here.
Charles G. Folks, class of 1950.
Here.
Euclid Clyde Francis, class of 1950.
Here.
William A. Galbraith, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
M. C. Guerin, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Judson Pritchard Germany, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Joe M. Gibson, class of 1950.
Here.
Michael Carl Glitch, class of 1950.
Here.
John Kendall Happy, class of 1950.
Here.
Colonel James Edward Harris, Sr., class of 1950.
Here.
Howard Roland Hicks, class of 1950.
Here.
Kenneth Eldridge Honeycutt, class of 1950.
Here.
Lane Elroy Horstman, class of 1950.
Here.
Jack R. Irish, class of 1950.
Here.
Lawrence S. King, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Dr. Robert Bernard Cross, class of 1950.
Here.
M. Allen Landry, class of 1950.
Here.
Curtis Hale Lee, class of 1950.
Here.
James Lawrence McFarland, class of 1950.
Here.
Lawrence G. Maxfield, class of 1950.
Here.
Wallace Raymond McGrew, class of 1950.
Here.
Dr. Walter Joseph Mistrick, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Harris Graves Moore, class of 1950.
Here.
Billy D. Moy, class of 1950.
Here.
William T. O'Connor III, class of 1950.
Here.
Colonel Henry Paul O'Neill, class of 1950.
Here.
William Beeler Owen, class of 1950.
Here.
William Thomas Plaggins, class of 1950.
Here.
Merrill Arnold Prokop Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Charles Rathmel, class of 1950.
Here.
Kenneth Eugene Ritter, class of 1950.
Here.
Eugene Weldon Robbins, class of 1950.
Here.
Richard Eccles Scott, class of 1950.
Here.
Benjamin Orland Sims, class of 1950.
Here.
Clifton O. Smith Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Bradley W. Swinney, class of 1950.
Here.
Colonel John D. Tartbutton, class of 1950.
Here.
William Alfred Bihon Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Carl Winston Walker, class of 1950.
Here.
Russell Rutledge Waterhouse, class of 1950.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Roy James West, class of 1950.
Here.
F.W. Wyeth, class of 1950.
Here.
Dr. Robert J. Young, class of 1950.
Here.
Edward Lee Arnold, class of 1951.
Here.
Ernest Holt Bumgart Jr., class of 1951.
Here.
The Honorable Billy F. Coker, class of 1951.
Here.
Cloyd James Dowling Jr., class of 1951.
Here.
David Turner Duncan Sr., class of 1951.
Here.
Dr. William Joe Dunlap, class of 1951.
Here.
Harold William Eichenhorst, class of 1951.
Here.
Gordon Rex Flack, class of 1951.
Here.
Robert G. Gray, class of 1951.
Here.
Ted Wallace Gillette, class of 1951.
Here.
James Ellis Higgins, class of 1951.
Here.
Robert O. Jackson, class of 1951.
Here.
John E. Jennings, class of 1951.
Here.
Westcombe R. Jones, Jr., class of 1951.
Here.
Dr. Halder T. Johnson, Jr., class of 1951.
Here.
George J. Klein, class of 1951.
Here.
George Henry Lang III, class of 1951.
Here.
Joe Mann, class of 1951.
Here.
Emery Long Meek, class of 1951.
Here.
Carl O. Moore, class of 1951.
Here.
Jack Harold New, class of 1951.
Here.
Vonnie Lee Pearson, Jr., class of 1951.
Here.
Thomas Boone Pickens, Jr., class of 1951.
Here.
Morton Rachofsky, class of 1951.
Here.
Walter Lawrence Reed, class of 1951.
Here.
Donald Lee Rogers, class of 1951.
Here.
Norman Hugh Ruddle, class of 1951.
Here.
Colonel Robert William Sigert, Jr., class of 1951.
Here.
Joe Weldon Streetman, class of 1951.
Here.
Elwyn Dean Thedford, class of 1951.
Here.
Travis Toland, class of 1951.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Ewing Weber, class of 1951.
Here.
Dr. Charles William Went, class of 1951.
Here.
Brian E. Zimmerman, class of 1951.
Here.
Samuel D. Anspoker, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel George Tony Anthony, class of 1952.
Here.
S. Dean Bowers, class of 1952.
Here.
Rayford Jefferson Brister, class of 1952.
Here.
Colonel Samuel Joe Cannon, class of 1952.
Here.
Glenn Edward Clark, class of 1952.
Here.
William Dwayne Daniel, class of 1952.
Here.
Malcolm Grady Dyer, class of 1952.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Joe Dudley Ekrat, Sr., class of 1952.
Here.
Jack J. Fink, class of 1952.
Here.
John Floyd Gibson, class of 1952.
Here.
Elwyn Drunell Havard, class of 1952.
Here.
Al Claire Haynes, class of 1952.
Here.
Simon Wesley Hendershot, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Victor Ray Hillman, class of 1952.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James Howell, class of 1952.
Here.
Russell Ray Hudeck, class of 1952.
Here.
Dr. Frank Joseph Koenig, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Colonel Paul J. Lemming, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Athol Dean Levisay, class of 1952.
Here.
Victor Levy, class of 1952.
Here.
Don H. Lippincott, class of 1952.
Here.
James Wilbur Little, class of 1952.
Here.
Thomas Gale Mabry, class of 1952.
Here.
Aurelius Ford Madison, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Thomas Wade Manis, class of 1952.
Here.
Norton Graham McDuffie, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Bruce McKay Miller, class of 1952.
Here.
Colonel Ralph Knight, class of 1952.
Here.
Alfred Hill Ogletree, class of 1952.
Here.
Murillo Patrick Olavides, class of 1952.
Here.
John Olin Patrick, class of 1952.
Here.
Don Robert Patton, class of 1952.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Calvin Perkins, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Bobby L. Pettit, class of 1952.
Here.
Billy Tom Rand, class of 1952.
Here.
Kenneth Beek Rollins, Sr., class of 1952.
Here.
T.H. Russell, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
A.D. Ricklick, class of 1952.
Here.
Paul Jerry Saunders, Sr., class of 1952.
Here.
Thomas Jefferson Savage, class of 1952.
Here.
Colonel Ray D. Shelton, class of 1952.
Here.
Delmar Darrell Sykes, Sr., class of 1952.
Here.
Joseph Weldon Steed, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
C. Jerry Stockholm, class of 1952.
Here.
Elmore Raoul Torn, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Kenneth Gordon Van Tassel, class of 1952.
Here.
Philip Thomas Wall, class of 1952.
Here.
James B. Woolridge, class of 1952.
Here.
Joseph Conrad Zern, class of 1952.
Here.
Alan Roland Black, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
J. Stephen Bryant, class of 1953.
Here.
Charles Edward Burgess, class of 1953.
Here.
J. C. Clark, class of 1953.
Here.
Robert Roland Cobb, class of 1953.
Here.
Oscar A. Derelict, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
James Hodges Demet, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
Dr. Tommy Tolson Dunnigan, class of 1953.
Here.
Douglas Evans Flatt, class of 1953.
Here.
Don C. Griffin, Sr., class of 1953.
Here.
Numson Moore Hale, class of 1953.
Here.
Donald Brian Hall, class of 1953.
Here.
Tommy George Hall, class of 1953.
Here.
Joe B. Harris, class of 1953.
Here.
Edward William Hegman, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
John Ware Jacobson, class of 1953.
Here.
Calvin Theodore Yannick, Sr., class of 1953.
Here.
Dr. Bobby L. Landrum, class of 1953.
Here.
Colonel Gilbert Richard Lay, class of 1953.
Here.
Orville R. Love, class of 1953.
Here.
Dan Arthur McKenzie, class of 1953.
Here.
John E. Pearson, class of 1953.
Here.
Jewel Dwayne Raymond, class of 1953.
Here.
Ronald Calvin Stinson, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
Colonel James H. Thomas, class of 1953.
Here.
Maxie James Triola, class of 1953.
Here.
Harold Jerome Urbanowski, class of 1953.
Here.
Billy Keith White, class of 1953.
Here.
Marion Donald Wooden, class of 1953.
Here.
Joseph D. Anderson, class of 1954.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Wayne Autry, class of 1954.
Here.
Robert Alfred Bowers, class of 1954.
Here.
Colquitt R. Bramlett, class of 1954.
Here.
Leonard Simpson Brown, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Gerald O. Buster, class of 1954.
Here.
D. Russell Crowley, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Major Harry Robert Ellis, class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. Newton Cass Ellis, class of 1954.
Here.
Major Monroe C. Flentge, class of 1954.
Here.
Robert Dale George, class of 1954.
Here.
Floyd Dwayne Grimland, class of 1954.
Here.
Gerard J. Harrington, class of 1954.
Here.
Claude Harris, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Waldo Wells Hensley, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Bert F. Cagle, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Robert Elam Lee, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Edwin R. Moss, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Colonel William C. Mackey, class of 1954.
Here.
Edward Hardy Martin, class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. Norbert Kurt Ohlendorf, class of 1954.
Here.
Glenn Roger File, class of 1954.
Here.
Charles Bedford Ponder, class of 1954.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Alvy Wayne Purcelli, class of 1954.
Here.
Billy M. Schnurr, class of 1954.
Here.
Douglas Scott, class of 1954.
Here.
John Frank Seat, class of 1954.
Here.
Harold Kimsey Shearer, class of 1954.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Norman Eugene Sliva, class of 1954.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Christopher C. Smith, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Shelby Glenn Smith, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Colonel John A. Steen, class of 1954.
Here.
Robert Harris Sumner, class of 1954.
Here.
Colonel John J. Top, class of 1954.
Here.
Billy C. Wallace, class of 1954.
Here.
Clayton W. Williams, Jr., class of 1954.
Here.
Dr. Herbert M. Bernard, class of 1955.
Here.
Robert William Beatty, class of 1955.
Here.
Gary G. Brandt, class of 1955.
Here.
James Donald Burks, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Francis Trudeau Kazayu, class of 1955.
Here.
Max Eugene Cook, class of 1955.
Here.
Colonel Charles Leland Davenport, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Warner Aiken Dunn, class of 1955.
Here.
Harold Lee Edge, class of 1955.
Here.
Edward Worsage, Jr., class of 1955.
Here.
Albert Ray Frankson, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Syed Mohammed Ghaffar, class of 1955.
Here.
The Honorable Oscar G. Garcia, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Arthur E. Garner, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Jed Harris Green, class of 1955.
Here.
Willard Dean Jenkins, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Alson Rankin Kennedy, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Murray H. Milford, class of 1955.
Here.
Charles H. Minter, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Page Wesley Morgan, class of 1955.
Here.
Joseph K. Morris, class of 1955.
Here.
Benny Truett Price, class of 1955.
Here.
Jerry Allen Pyle, class of 1955.
Here.
Donald Frederick Roth, class of 1955.
Here.
Philip G. Sanders, class of 1955.
Here.
William Winfield Scott, Jr., class of 1955.
Here.
Jack Edgar Spell, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. William Jack H. Stone, class of 1955.
Here.
Richard Phillips Vick, class of 1955.
Here.
Enrique Contreras Villarreal, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Shelley Bruce Walker, class of 1955.
Here.
John Bennett White III, class of 1955.
Here.
Leroy White, class of 1955.
Here.
Donald Martin Woodman, class of 1955.
Here.
Bobby R. Wright, class of 1955.
Here.
Edmund Davis Wolfe, class of 1955.
Here.
Don Ray Burrow, class of 1956.
Here.
Nancy Stevens Craig, class of 1956.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell Denard, Jr., class of 1956.
Here.
Joe F. Dillard, class of 1956.
Here.
John Anthony Gentry, class of 1956.
Here.
Vincent J. Giardina, class of 1956.
Here.
Richard L. Griffin, class of 1956.
Here.
Dr. Clyde C. Houston, Jr., class of 1956.
Here.
Billy P. Huddleston, class of 1956.
Here.
John Lawrence Irwin, class of 1956.
Here.
Curtis Dean Cornegay, class of 1956.
Here.
Dr. Frank E. Mann, Jr., class of 1956.
Here.
Alan Martin May, class of 1956.
Here.
Avery Edsel McKinney, class of 1956.
Here.
Edward James Pasinchik, class of 1956.
Here.
Margarito V. Reyes, class of 1956.
Here.
H. Lee Richards, Jr., class of 1956.
Here.
Dr. Hugh Cameron Sutton, class of 1956.
Here.
William A. Terry, Sr., class of 1956.
Here.
Dr. James Albert Walmsley, class of 1956.
Here.
Donald Albert Watson, class of 1956.
Here.
Joe Ross Abel, class of 1957.
Here.
J. Albert, class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. John Paul Arnold, class of 1957.
Here.
Stanley Lewis Barnes, class of 1957.
Here.
John Glenn Basinger, class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. John Marshall Blaine, class of 1957.
Here.
Bobby Dale Bostic, class of 1957.
Here.
Donald Burt Braun, class of 1957.
Here.
Harry Leroy Brown, class of 1957.
Here.
Edward Jowers Burkhead, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. Jimmy Clay Burns, class of 1957.
Here.
Bob R. Clendenin, class of 1957.
Here.
John Frederick Cobb, class of 1957.
Here.
Tommy Lynn Darnell, class of 1957.
Here.
Donald Herbert Friedrich, class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. W. Barton Griffith, class of 1957.
Here.
Philip Joseph Haas, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel William D. Horton, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Dale J. Hutton, class of 1957.
Here.
Thomas Harold Kavanaugh, class of 1957.
Here.
Ronald Edward Kennedy, class of 1957.
Here.
Charles Wayne Kinney, class of 1957.
Here.
John Henry Kirkpatrick, class of 1957.
Here.
Major Robert M. Cagle, class of 1957.
Here.
Kenneth Ray LeSueur, class of 1957.
Here.
George Robert Long, class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. Donald Edwin Longnecker, class of 1957.
Here.
James Orrin Manley, class of 1957.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Leroy Delbert Mathis, class of 1957.
Here.
David William Miller, class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. Murray Milner, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
William H. Rosen, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Ramiro E. Salazar, class of 1957.
Here.
J. Philip Smith, class of 1957.
Here.
Gilbert Noel Steele, class of 1957.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James Sadler Tinsley, class of 1957.
Here.
James Derry Vandermeer, class of 1957.
Here.
Dr. George Hardy Vincent, class of 1957.
Here.
Frank Maury Weinberger, class of 1957.
Here.
Jean L. Wismer, class of 1957.
Here.
Willie Conway Younger, Jr., class of 1957.
Here.
Robert Joseph Beal, class of 1958.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Lee Biskup, class of 1958.
Here.
Clarence Anthony Bolner, class of 1958.
Here.
Kenton G. Brown, class of 1958.
Here.
Wilfred Andrew Bruger, Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Arthur A. Camp, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Damon Rowe Campbell, class of 1958.
Here.
Douglas Lee Campbell, class of 1958.
Here.
Hector Armando Cardenas, class of 1958.
Here.
Ronald George Dillon, Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Hillary Brumley Doran, Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Roy C. Fengi, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Don Ray Fisher, class of 1958.
Here.
John E. Gerber, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Samuel Edward Glass, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Joseph M. Glixman, class of 1958.
Here.
Major General Paul Lee Greenberg, class of 1958.
Here.
Ted L. Hand, class of 1958.
Here.
David Kenneth Heggs, class of 1958.
Here.
Garland Lewis Heimel, class of 1958.
Here.
Jack Bennett Holder, class of 1958.
Here.
Colonel Phil Callip Hurley, class of 1958.
Here.
Gerald Lane Jordan, class of 1958.
Here.
Leroy A. Caderly, class of 1958.
Here.
David Austin Condrela, class of 1958.
Here.
Colonel John S. Cuban, class of 1958.
Here.
Dr. Carol F. Lamb, class of 1958.
Here.
Teddy Ray Lowe, class of 1958.
Here.
William Jake Lyon, class of 1958.
Here.
Louis Joseph Martin, Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Robert Joe Mattis, class of 1958.
Here.
David Wesley McLean, class of 1958.
Here.
Joseph Earl Malugan, class of 1958.
Here.
Benjamin Rush Milam, class of 1958.
Here.
Bethel Eugene Oni, class of 1958.
Here.
Robert Marcus Patrick Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Ernest Rusley, class of 1958.
Here.
Weldon Eugene Rudd, class of 1958.
Here.
George Albert Selensky, class of 1958.
Here.
James Edward Smith, class of 1958.
Here.
George F. Susaris Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
Hoyt Lee Stevens, class of 1958.
Here.
Howard D. Templin, class of 1958.
Here.
Warren Eugene White, class of 1958.
Here.
George Roney Yonts, Jr., class of 1958.
Here.
David Eugene Alex, class of 1959.
Here.
James Edward Ayers, class 1959.
Here.
Albert Lawrence Ball, class of 1959.
Here.
David Jonathan Bratton, Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
Dr. Jack Douglas Bryant, class of 1959.
Here.
Charles D. Burnett, class of 1959.
Here.
Jerry Walker Corbin, class of 1959.
Here.
John Michael DeLon, class of 1959.
Here.
Dr. Don Dean Dwyer, class of 1959.
Here.
Dennis C. Holly, class of 1959.
Here.
Wilson Bruce Hudson, class of 1959.
Here.
Robert Daniel Hyde, Jr., class of 1959.
Here.
Dr. James Berkeley Laird, class of 1959.
Here.
James Robert Langston, class of 1959.
Here.
Norman L. Marenholtz, class of 1959.
Here.
Hugh Eugene McCarley, class of 1959.
Here.
Harold Lee Ogden, class of 1959.
Here.
Don Hamilton Peterson, class of 1959.
Here.
Robert Joe Pogue, class of 1959.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel John A. Polk, class of 1959.
Here.
Lyndon Boyd Robertson, class of 1959.
Here.
Jack Kanzler Sandlin, class of 1959.
Here.
Billy Don Sevier, class of 1959.
Here.
Herbert Ray Stoner, class of 1959.
Here.
Gareth Wells Tolman, class of 1959.
Here.
Jesus H. Vicarelli, class of 1959.
Here.
Dr. Benjamin Vickers, class of 1959.
Here.
James Mayo Wagoner, class of 1959.
Here.
Carl Ray Walker, class of 1959.
Here.
David Leon Adams, class of 1960.
Here.
Dr. Alan S. Anderson, class of 1960.
Here.
Roy Lee Engelmiller, class of 1960.
Here.
Oscar Lee Atkins, class of 1960.
Here.
Marcus Jean Blagg, class of 1960.
Here.
Kenneth Allen Bobo, class of 1960.
Here.
Olin Wheeler Brown, class of 1960.
Here.
Harold Lee Carter, class of 1960.
Here.
James R. Chapman, class of 1960.
Here.
Colonel Paul Michael Townsend Cook, Jr., class of 1960.
Here.
Edwin Earl Dismuke, class of 1960.
Here.
Shelton R. Dokerson, Jr., class of 1960.
Here.
Norman Kenneth Dyson, class of 1960.
Here.
Oscar Talmadge Goins, class of 1960.
Here.
Donald Davis Griffin, class of 1960.
Here.
Roy Tate Gunn, class of 1960.
Here.
Dr. Richard Horace Hawkins, class of 1960.
Here.
Richard W. Hickman, class of 1960.
Here.
Vernon C. Holcomb, class of 1960.
Here.
John Edward Hoover, class of 1960.
Here.
Charles Morris Kohler, Sr., class of 1960.
Here.
Joe M. Leeper, class of 1960.
Here.
William Jackson Lindsay, class of 1960.
Here.
Charles Allen McBride, class of 1960.
Here.
Jerry M. Murph, class of 1960.
Here.
Norman Carter Orthwine, class of 1960.
Here.
Alan Joseph Owings, class of 1960.
Here.
Larry Joe Shiflett, class of 1960.
Here.
Joseph John Sikirka, class of 1960.
Here.
Colonel Robert Henry Shawley, class of 1960.
Here.
Williams Hiram Smith, class of 1960.
Here.
Robert Clayton Sneed, class of 1960.
Here.
Thomas Robinson Starr, class of 1960.
Here.
Morris E. Strahan, class of 1960.
Here.
Billy W. Van Sickle, class of 1960.
Here.
John Allen Aaron Way III, class of 1960.
Here.
Stanley Fred Weed, class of 1960.
Here.
Dr. Robert Lovell Wilson, Jr., class of 1960.
Here.
Richard Lee Yakeley, class of 1960.
Here.
Edward Emilian Zielinski, class of 1960.
Here. James Robert Arnold, class of 1961.
Here.
Arthur Charles Barclay, Sr., class of 1961.
Here.
Gary K. Barte, class of 1961.
Here.
Dr. Robert William Botard, class of 1961.
Here.
William Norman Brinkley, class of 1961.
Here.
Duncan Cicero Covington, class of 1961.
Here.
Jorge A. Davila, class of 1961.
Here.
James Sharp Gallatin, class of 1961.
Here.
Marvin J. Gerard, class of 1961.
Here.
Franklin Ray Hallman, class of 1961.
Here.
Reverend Harry Arthur Harrington, Jr., class of 1961.
Here.
Daniel E. Kasperitz, class of 1961.
Here.
James K. Latimer, Jr., class of 1961.
Here.
Mark Majors III, class of 1961.
Here.
S. Rush McGinty, class of 1961.
Here.
Richard Carroll Meyer, class of 1961.
Here.
John Barnett O'Brien, class of 1961.
Here.
Dr. Mark Otho Oster, class of 1961.
Here.
Marvin Allen Bradley, class of 1961.
Here.
James Terrell Rector, class of 1961.
Here.
Richard Jacobs Reiser, class of 1961.
Here.
Robert James Rectorate, class of 1961.
Here.
Wallace Ridgway Richmond, Jr., class of 1961.
Here.
Oscar Science, class of 1961.
Here.
Carl Frank Schreiner, class of 1961.
Here.
Paul Michael Stern, class of 1961.
Here.
Don Richard Turlington, class of 1961.
Here.
William Baker Wood II, class of 1961.
Here.
Reed Straub Armstrong, class of 1962.
Here.
Carlos Enrique Blanco, class of 1962.
Here.
Lester Allen Burris, class of 1962.
Here.
Otha Clinton Chick, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Colonel Grange Simmons Coffin, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Robert John Davidson, Sr., class of 1962.
Here.
Robert Calvin Donald, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Johnny A. Dorachik, class of 1962.
Here.
Gregory A. Garcia, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Howard Maxwell Hayes, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. J. Selwyn Hollingsworth, class of 1962.
Here.
James Patrick Hudson, class of 1962.
Here.
Alejandro Julio Cato, class of 1962.
Here.
Robert Arlen Lee, class of 1962.
Here.
Captain James Winston List, class of 1962.
Here.
Felix Robert Lloyd, class of 1962.
Here.
Johnny Mac Moreau, class of 1962.
Here.
Johnny A. Moore, class of 1962.
Here.
Tommy Ned Nickel, class of 1962.
Here.
Jack Denton Odell Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Major General Gerald Harrison Putman, class of 1962.
Here.
Lynn James Ratcliffe, class of 1962.
Here.
Samuel F. Rhodes, class of 1962.
Here.
Logic Tabola II, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Robert George Weatherold, class of 1962.
Here.
Don Earl Wilkes, class of 1962.
Here.
Dr. Jack Allen Barnes, class of 1963.
Here.
James William Brewer, class of 1963.
Here.
Eugene N. Bird, class of 1963.
Here.
Lawrence M. Cannon, class of 1963.
Here.
Colonel Gerald Gallatin Fonville, class of 1963.
Here.
Ronald Jean Haley, class of 1963.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Earl John Henderson, class of 1963.
Here.
Albert Jarrell Hintz Jr., class of 1963.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Edwin H. Higgins, class of 1963.
Here.
Howard Lee Holcomb, class of 1963.
Here.
Joseph Paul Kiker, class of 1963.
Here.
Louis Carl Coyne, class of 1963.
Here.
Richard Wayne McGaughy, class of 1963.
Here.
Carlos Victoriano Mejia, class of 1963.
Here.
Eugene P. Miller, class of 1963.
Here.
David Lyle Milligan, class of 1963.
Here.
Dr. Harvey Daniel Pearson, class of 1963.
Here.
Aggie Muster Day by Miss Margaret Rudder. We gather here to mark the day Aggies proudly stand, to honor those who've gone before to the promised land. Each name is called upon the roll. Comrades answer, here. Trumpets sound their sad goodbyes to those we held so dear. All heads are bowed and silent, pledging never to forget. While rifles fire their last salute, echoes answer yet. To their memory, we'll be true. We will take their place, one for all and all for one, ever in thy grace. We'll meet again another day, reunion while we pray, to ask thy blessing on each one on this muster day. Aggie Muster Day.
Colonel Harold Winfrey Rainey, class of 1963.
Here.
John Allen Ray Jr., class of 1963.
Here.
Jack Donald Redding, class of 1963.
Here.
Dr. William Ralph Robertson, class of 1963.
Here.
Dr. James Irvin Schrader, class of 1963.
Here.
Henry Andrew Shudala, Jr., class of 1963.
Here.
Colonel James Francis Sullivan II, class of 1963.
Here.
Wayman Lee Thurman, class of 1963.
Here.
Clifford Whitlock, class of 1963.
Here.
Dr. James Charles Wilson, class of 1963.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Bobby J. Woolley, class of 1963.
Here.
Garland Clifford Wright, class of 1963.
Here.
Jerry Vetter Allen, class of 1964.
Here.
Wade William Beckman III, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Larry Don Braidfoot, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Stanley McGuffey Brantley, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Keith Allen Clark, class of 1964.
Here.
Obi Illy Corey Jr., class of 1964.
Here.
Major Jack William Curry, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Paul Miller Elliott Jr., class of 1964.
Here.
Sammy Joe George, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Samuel Allen Gilmore, class of 1964.
Here.
Jerry Wayne Gunter, class of 1964.
Here.
Kenneth Ray Haggard, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Luciano Herrera Jr., class of 1964.
Here.
Edward Villarreal Hunt, class of 1964.
Here.
Stanley Max Irvin, class of 1964.
Here.
Mark L. Jackson, class of 1964.
Here.
Lucius Earl Jones, class of 1964.
Here.
Cam Carrington Larry Jr., class of 1964.
Here.
Major Kenneth Urban Lem, class of 1964.
Here.
Juan Luis Marciak, class of 1964.
Here.
Robert S. McGowan, class of 1964.
Here.
Jack Wayne Nobles, class of 1964.
Here.
Norman Delbert Pohl, class of 1964.
Here.
Edward T. Post, class of 1964.
Here.
Alan Lewis Schlant, class of 1964.
Here.
Melvin Lee Sparks, class of 1964.
Here.
Delbert William Van Cleve, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Roger White, class of 1964.
Here.
Don Elton Wilson, class of 1964.
Here.
Gordon W. Wilson, class of 1964.
Here.
Colonel Johnson Burleson Woodall, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Lathan Allen Barnes, class of 1965.
Here.
Charles Edwin Burge, class of 1965.
Here.
Captain Barry M. Campbell, class of 1965.
Here.
Robert P. Devine, Jr., class of 1965.
Here.
Clifton Alexander Emerson, class of 1965.
Here.
James Desmond Foreman, class of 1965.
Here.
Joe William Gilbert, class of 1965.
Here.
William E. Hadaway, class of 1965.
Here.
Michael Walter Hyde, class of 1965.
Here.
Dr. Charles Benjamin Ivy, class of 1965.
Here.
Clinton J. Kesterson, class of 1965.
Here.
Dr. Clifton Dale Lemons, class of 1965.
Here.
Colonel Cook Heron Ledweiler, class of 1965.
Here.
Pablo Mayers, Jr., class of 1965.
Here.
Russell James Richard, class of 1965.
Here.
Colonel Glenn B. Rumley, Jr., class of 1965.
Here.
Dr. Leon H. Russell, Jr., class of 1965.
Here.
Herman Tony Schlager, class of 1965.
Here.
Dr. Peggy D. Skaggs, class of 1965.
Here.
Reverend Eric L. Spencer, class of 1965.
Here.
Harold Robert Stafford, class of 1965.
Here.
Brian H. Steves, class of 1965.
Here.
Melvin Lewis Sunderman, class of 1965.
Here.
Cornelius Alfred Tilgman, Jr., class of 1965.
Here.
James R. Winch, class of 1965.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James T. Zumwalt, class of 1965.
Here.
Donald Ray Armstrong, class of 1966.
Here.
Dr. Doyle L. Beavers, class of 1966.
Here.
Eugene J. Berger, class of 1966.
Here.
Colonel Eugene H. Bishop, Jr., class of 1966.
Here.
Dr. H. Marie Bogda, class of 1966.
Here.
Billy Carl Burton, class of 1966.
Here.
Rajana Kant D. Desai, class of 1966.
Here.
Clifford Thomas Dungan, class of 1966.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel David W. Fuller, Jr., class of 1966.
Here.
Edward Henderson George, class of 1966.
Here.
Lester Branch Hatcher, Jr., class of 1966.
Here.
Laura June Whitworth Graby Langley, class of 1966.
Here.
Frank Lopez, Jr., class of 1966.
Here.
David W. Majors, class of 1966.
Here.
Carl Patrick Martin, class of 1966.
Here.
Robert Langston Nickel, class of 1966.
Here.
Paul E. Pate, class of 1966.
Here.
Carol John Raleigh, Jr., class of 1966.
Here.
Bobby R. Robinson, class of 1966.
Here.
Cecil H. Scarborough, class of 1966.
Here.
Dr. James Charles Slinky, class of 1966.
Here.
Edward William Schultz, Sr., class of 1966.
Here.
Ronald Arthur Smith, class of 1966.
Here.
Dr. C. Wayne Terrell, class of 1966.
Here.
Beverly Stone Tequigney, class of 1966.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James T. Trammell, class of 1966.
Here.
Robert Dwight Tuseth, class of 1966.
Here.
John Eldred Kozad, class of 1981.
Here.
Richard Collins Yarborough, class of 1966.
Here.
Janice Ann Hall Zapata, class of 1966.
Here.
Ronald Lane Amex, class of 1967.
Here.
Catherine M. Anderson, class of 1967.
Here.
Margaret Olivia Baines, class of 1967.
Here.
Charles Edward Brandt, class of 1967.
Here.
Richard Earl Burleson, Jr., class of 1967.
Here.
Mildred M. Foyer, class of 1967.
Here.
Romeo Cordero Garcia, class of 1967.
Here.
Charles Stephen Green, class of 1967.
Here.
Dr. Thomas Jefferson Havard III, class of 1967.
Here.
Major LeJohn Reed Hutton, class of 1967.
Here.
Frank Huntley Jones, Jr., class of 1967.
Here.
Kenneth Warren Lyles, Jr., class of 1967.
Here.
Larry Adolph Maresh, class of 1967.
Here.
Richard Burrell Partridge, class of 1967.
Here.
Dr. Abdur Rahman, class of 1967.
Here.
Aubrey Lee Rowland, class of 1967.
Here.
John B. Strange, class of 1967.
Here.
Wilbert Anthony Terrio, Jr., class of 1967.
Here.
Richard S. Backus, class of 1968.
Here.
Isaac John Benson, class of 1968.
Here.
George Davis Berry, class of 1968.
Here.
Roy James Burke, class of 1968.
Here.
William Charles Brendan, class of 1968.
Here.
Richard O. Brewer, class of 1968.
Here.
Robert Richard Canfield, class of 1968.
Here.
James B. Carlson, class of 1968.
Here.
Dr. Edward Oda Daniel, class of 1968.
Here.
Dr. Mary Lynn Davidson DeShazo, class of 1968.
Here.
Gilberto Ferreira, class of 1968.
Here.
Carl D. Frenchers, class of 1968.
Here.
Carl M. James, class of 1968.
Here.
Dr. Arnold N. Levine, class of 1968.
Here.
Frank C. Litteris III, class of 1968.
Here.
John R. Loeffler, class of 1968.
Here.
Dr. Merrill H. McGlamory Jr., class of 1968.
Here.
Ricardo Aravedas, class of 1968.
Here.
Dr. Michael James Packlet, class of 1968.
Here.
Dr. Roger C. Pfaffenberger, class of 1968.
Here.
David Ward Pruitt, class of 1968.
Here.
Dr. Stephen Horn Roach, class of 1968.
Here.
Willie David Starr, class of 1968.
Here.
Ed Swindle, class of 1968.
Here.
Frank Barclay Thatcher II, class of 1968.
Here.
William Robinson Wade, class of 1968.
Here.
Eudoxie Ann Wooten, class of 1968.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Frank Albert Baldwin, Jr., class of 1969.
Here.
Gary Edward Bearden, class of 1969.
Here.
Howard Leland Bose, class of 1969.
Here.
Roger D. Bradshaw, class of 1969.
Here.
Tommy Dale Clark, class of 1969.
Here.
Donald Joe Cole, class of 1969.
Here.
Bruce Franklin Edwards, Jr., class of 1969.
Here.
Irenia Hopt Ellis, class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. James D. Elmore, class of 1969.
Here.
Sherry Knox Fewen, class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. Stephen Allen Holditch, class of 1969.
Here.
Robert L. Johnson, class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. Lyle Ray Kallenbach, class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. Anand Singh Katiyar, class of 1969.
Here.
Roger Wayne Cloppy, class of 1969.
Here.
Russell Dewey Large, class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. Emilio Mutis Duplat, class of 1969.
Here.
Jack Crawford Parker, class of 1969.
Here.
Samuel Jackson Parks, Jr., class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. Jerry Bob Pierce, class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. Wayne Douglas Prey, class of 1969.
Here.
Thomas Anthony Roberts, class of 1969.
Here.
Harry Charles Schmidt, class of 1969.
Here.
Danny Glenn Seal, class of 1969.
Here.
Here. Elvis Dale Shankles, class of 1969.
Here.
Here. Richard Frederick Smullen Jr., class of 1969.
Here.
James Robert Story, class of 1969.
Here.
Jimmy W. Taylor, class of 1969.
Here.
Here. Dr. Larry Paul Thornburg, class of 1969.
Here.
Richard William Tobabin, class of 1969.
Here.
Samuel Thomas Weaver, Jr., class of 1969.
Here.
Dr. Harold Thornton Welch III, class of 1969.
Here.
Lynn Wilson Atchison, class of 1970.
Here.
Winston Gale Beam, class of 1970.
Here.
Arthur W. Burquist, class of 1970.
Here.
Robert Plant Breaker, class of 1970.
Here.
William Joseph Brela, class of 1970.
Here.
Clifton Parker Carter III, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Donald Bruce Cleveland, class of 1970.
Here.
Gary Thomas Cottingham, class of 1970.
Here.
Donald Sherwood Crocker, class of 1970.
Here.
Randall Reese Davis, class of 1970.
Here.
Donald Ewald Effenberger, class of 1970.
Here.
Thomas Lee Gailey, class of 1970.
Here.
Arthur Gerald Geistweit, class of 1970.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Grant Dalby Gordon III, class of 1970.
Here.
Here. Joe Edwin Greenslade, class of 1970.
Here.
Here. Lieutenant Colonel Howard S. Griffin, class of 1970.
Here.
Here.
Alice Berry Hempel, class of 1970.
Here.
Sarah Ann Hintz, class of 1970.
Here.
Anthony Lee Jones, class of 70.
Here.
Jack Leon Kobar, class of 1970.
Here.
Leonard John Kowalski, class of 1970.
Here.
Robert Burton Mason, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. George Pat McDonald, class of 1970.
Here.
Colonel William Ernest Moeller, Jr., class of 1970.
Here.
Jerry Moore, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Jimmy Archer Moore, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Brian J. Morgan, class of 1970.
Here.
Edward Philip Newman, class of 1970.
Here.
Pat Douglas O'Brien, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Patrick E. Phillips, class of 1970.
Here.
Tom Henry Sathery, class of 1970.
Here.
Lee Phillips Schlanger, class of 1970.
Here.
Douglas L. Shannon, class of 1970.
Here.
Darrell Branch Shawver, class of 1970.
Here.
Glenn Ovid Temple, class of 1970.
Here.
Alan Benson Thompson, class of 1970.
Here.
Joseph Vincent Titoris Jr., class of 1970.
Here.
William D. Waltman, class of 1970.
Here.
Tom Ben Weishaupt, class of 1970.
Here.
Glendon Robert Whitehouse, class of 1970.
Here.
Timothy Mark Walters, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Sandra Whitaker Coates, class of 1971.
Here.
James Curtis Davis, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. Curtis Allen Dixon, class of 1971.
Here.
J. Valton Dooley, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. Norma Neal Fabian, class of 1971.
Here.
Reverend Robert J. Fessler, class of 1971.
Here.
Eugene Lamar Finney III, class of 1971.
Here.
Charles Stephen Huckabee, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. J. Selman Holland Jr., class of 1971.
Here.
William Russell Howard, class of 1971.
Here.
Alan Sneed Lockhart, class of 1971.
Here.
Ralph Gonzalez Martinez, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. Patrick Darden Mathis, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. William A. Mulkey, class of 1971.
Here.
Roland K. Scott, class of 1971.
Here.
William Charles Scott, class of 1971.
Here.
Dr. Charles Leroy Schilling, class of 1971.
Here.
Thomas Orrin Sykes, class of 1971.
Here.
Michael L. Simmons, class of 1971.
Here.
John Walter Vogelsang, Jr., class of 1971.
Here.
Philip Michael Waldrop, class of 1971.
Here.
Mark Wayne Whitley, class of 1971.
Here.
Curtis Hogan Wilker, class of 1971.
Here.
Gerald E. Worthington, class of 1971.
Here.
Jimmy Lee Bell, class of 1972.
Here.
William Edward Bradbury, class of 1972.
Here.
Michael Lee Burkett, class of 1972.
Here.
James Frederick Carpenter, class of 1972.
Here.
Roy M. Crawford, Jr., class of 1972.
Here.
David E. Dodier, class of 1972.
Here.
Dr. Benny D. Embry, class of 1972.
Here.
Robert Stephen Flumach, class of 1972.
Here.
Glenn Ray Handel, class of 1972.
Here.
Charles Lloyd Hodges, class of 1972.
Here.
Cedric Bryant Lloyd II, class of 1972.
Here.
Michael Dennis Malloy, class of 1972.
Here.
Michael David McCorse, class of 1972.
Here.
Clay J. Henry Meyer, Jr., class of 1972.
Here.
Jep E. Pate, Jr., class of 1972.
Here.
David Lee Wrights, class of 1972.
Here.
Hayden Robert Smith, class of 1972.
Here.
James Owen Watkins, class of 1972.
Here.
Dr. Michael E. Weiss, class of 1972.
Here.
William Arthur Whitlock, class of 1972.
Here.
Dr. P. Jonathan Young, class of 1972.
Here.
Mark Gordon Zahn, class of 1972.
Here.
M. Ann Abbey, class of 1973.
Here.
Ronald R. Emery, class of 1973.
Here.
Milton Bruce Gates, class of 1973.
Here.
Dr. Charles John Grew, Jr., class of 1973.
Here.
Timothy Tynan Griesenbeck, Jr., class of 1973.
Here.
Orville Lynn Hooks, class of 1973.
Here.
Thomas Melton Howell, Jr., class of 1973.
Here.
Lee Stephen Hunt, class of 1973.
Here.
Dr. Joseph Michael Jez, class of 1973.
Here.
Dr. Robert Francis Logan, Jr., class of 1973.
Here.
Dr. Virgil Melvin Mayab, Jr., class of 1973.
Here.
John Steve Norman, class of 1973.
Here.
Thomas Joseph Pislak, class of 1973.
Here.
Stephen Dale Snyder, class of 1973.
Here.
David Paul Van de List, class of 1973.
Here.
Sandy Ray Bate, class of 1974.
Here.
Lee L. Beach, class of 1974.
Here.
Gregory Brian Bond, class of 1974.
Here.
Joe Raymond Calloway, class of 1974.
Here.
J. Stephen Chenault, class of 1974.
Here.
Kathleen Denise Mason Fisher, class of 1974.
Here.
Carlos Gomez, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Arthur J. Haley, class of 1974.
Here.
Manif M. Maudi, class of 1974.
Here. Here.
Dr. George Randall Harker, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Patrick D. Jarrett, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Stuart Scott Casey, Sr., class of 1974.
Here.
John Robert Lidner, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Robert W. Lorenzen, class of 1974.
Here.
Jane Kerr Moorhead, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Hoyt Turner Morris, class of 1974.
Here.
William R. Panconian, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Alan Wayne Parker, class of 1974.
Here.
Regina Roming Pinsek, class of 1974.
Here.
Michael Dare Rivers, class of 1974.
Here.
Joe Allen Rowland, class of 1974.
Here.
Reed Michael Satoff, class of 1974.
Here.
Paul Scott Champagne, class of 1974.
Here.
Lawrence Henry Sweet, class of 1974.
Here.
Elmo Irvin Taylor, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Mark Stephen Tolson, class of 1974.
Here.
Ronald W. Trammell, class of 1974.
Here.
Barbara Gale Woodard, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Amelia Sinlow, class of 1975.
Here.
Dr. Wayne Eldon Clark, class of 1975.
Here.
Timothy Kelly Curtis, class of 1975.
Here.
William Curtis Dempsey IV, class of 1975.
Here.
Dr. Patrick Hardy Dudley, class of 1975.
Here.
James Earl Freeman III, class of 1975.
Here.
Stephen Ronald Gibson, class of 1975.
Here.
Glenn Everett Green, class of 1975.
Here.
Dr. Glenn Leroy Hansen, class of 1975.
Here.
Charles Wayne Jones, class of 1975.
Here.
Carrie Lacina, class of 1975.
Here.
Marjorie Ann Marion, class of 1975.
Here.
Stephen W. Miller, class of 1975.
Here.
Robert Allen Raby, class of 1975.
Here.
Robert Clay Rao, class of 1975.
Here.
Jimmy Allen Riggs, class of 1975.
Here.
James Frederick Rose, class of 1975.
Here.
Vera Ann Sirat, class of 1975.
Here.
Vincent A. Shields, class of 1975.
Here.
Dr. Balaji B. Singh, class of 1975.
Here.
Tommy Carl Turner, class of 1975.
Here.
Bruce Frederick Welsh III, class of 1975.
Here.
Michael F. Wright, class of 1975.
Here.
Carol S. Yeoman, class of 1975.
Here.
John Alex Biggers Jr., class of 1976.
Here.
Celia K. Bowman, class of 1976.
Here.
John C. Bullard, class of 1976.
Here.
Linda Marie Campbell, class of 1976.
Here.
Gaitlin William Edwards II, class of 1976.
Here.
Reynaldo Espinosa, class of 1976.
Here.
Alton Aaron Gilbert, class of 1976.
Here.
Larry Wayne Glenn's, class of 1976.
Here.
William Nelson Griffin, class of 1976.
Here.
Dr. Mike Wayne Hyduck, class of 1976.
Here.
Stephen Cannon Hart, class of 1976.
Here.
Dane A. Hobbs, class of 1976.
Here.
Mabel Margaret Hudson, class of 1976.
Here.
Jackie Dawn Johnson, class of 1976.
Here.
Ernest Parker Kirkham, class of 1976.
Here.
Felipa Molina Lorenzen, class of 1976.
Here.
Julio Samuel Moncelius, class of 1976.
Here.
Dr. Richard Allen Mays, class of 1976.
Here.
Donald Hugh McCarn, Jr., class of 1976.
Here.
Alan Ray Moore, class of 1976.
Here.
Sharon McCandless Newton, class of 1976.
Here.
Jim F. Rigby, class of 1976.
Here.
Edward C. Simonini, class of 1976.
Here.
Nemette Jean Soley, class of 1976.
Here.
Harold Ray Stanford, class of 1976.
Here.
Ronald Lynn Tagliabue, class of 1976.
Here.
Douglas Leo Wiederstein, class of 1976.
Here.
Stephen Wayne Williams, class of 1976.
Here.
Judy Lynn Franz Wynn, class of 1976.
Here.
Mary Kasperzik Alexander, class of 1977.
Here.
Margaret Ann Prey Beatles, class of 1977.
Here.
Paul Allen Bradshaw, class of 1977.
Here.
Roy Edwin Burnett Jr., class of 1977.
Here.
Jeffrey Mark Irwin, class of 1977.
Here.
Ronnie Lee Finley, class of 1977.
Here.
Dr. Jeanette A. Fenton, class of 1977.
Here.
Margaret Ann Finke, class of 1977.
Here.
Dr. Henry Sessom Foster Jr., class of 1977.
Here.
Mary Felkman Lundquist Lozek, class of 1977.
Here.
Dr. Don Carter King, class of 1977.
Here.
Gladys Ann Kuntz, class of 1977.
Here.
Timothy B. McPeak, class of 1977.
Here.
Robert E. Neal, class of 1977.
Here.
Harold A. Palmer, class of 1977.
Here.
Colonel Robert Wallace Radcliffe, class of 1977.
Here.
Dr. Stephen Dwayne Reynolds, class of 1977.
Here.
Manuel J. Rivas, class of 1977.
Here.
Marilyn K. Rollings, class of 1977.
Here. Here.
John J. Seligman Jr., class of 1977.
Here.
David Ray Shipman, class of 1977.
Here. Here.
James Edmelaire Stinson II, class of 1977.
Here.
Louis Wayne Stone, class of 1977.
Here.
Dr. William R. Teague, class of 1977.
Here.
Dr. Benjamin Earl Tharp, class of 1977.
Here.
Bonnie Bell Weber, class of 1977.
Here.
Jeffrey Mark Barker, class of 1978.
Here.
Janice Lynn Brister, class of 1978.
Here.
Alvis L. Broquette, Jr., class of 1978.
Here.
Joe David Brunson, Sr., class of 1978.
Here.
Louis Joseph Ciochetto, class of 1978.
Here.
Charles Ellery Durrett, Jr., class of 1978.
Here.
Brian Porch Fisher III, class of 1978.
Here.
Thomas W. Hort, class of 1978.
Here.
Marjorie Susan Jonas, class of 1978.
Here.
Ricardo Morellis, Jr., class of 1978.
Here.
Jerry Alton Moon, Jr., class of 1978.
Here.
Roy Douglas Murray, class of 1978.
Here.
Andrew Logan Need, class of 1978.
Here.
Ronaldo A. Ortiz, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Enrique Ospina, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Stephen Lamar Pierce, class of 1978.
Here.
Cynthia Diane Rathmel, class of 1978.
Here.
Russell Vernon Ratslow, class of 1978.
Here.
Stephen Frank Salathiel, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Frederick Charles Schlimmer II, class of 1978.
Here.
Helen Gale Pope Sewell, class of 1978.
Here.
Robert Derek Schultz, class of 1978.
Here.
Thomas Lloyd Swanke, class of 1978.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Joe Shield Wallace, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Alicia Renee Wills, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Carol Harris Wood, class of 1978.
Here.
Glenn Ross Ashley, class of 1979.
Here.
Marcia Wagner Barker, class of 1979.
Here.
Michael Vincent Barnett, class of 1979.
Here.
Barbara Jean Crow Beeler, class of 1979.
Here.
Michael J. Case, class of 1979.
Here.
Stephen Edward Casmus, class of 1979.
Here.
Stanley Allen Dixon, class of 1979.
Here.
H. Sparks Doris, class of 1979.
Here.
Michael Christ Haynes, class of 1979.
Here.
Marie Nell Hoff, class of 1979.
Here.
Dr. David Theodore Holt, class of 1979.
Here.
Marion Agnes Jameson, class of 1979.
Here.
David C. Parrish, class of 1979.
Here.
Margaret Ruth Sanders, class of 1979.
Here.
David Talbot Small, class of 1979.
Here.
Dr. Dudley Templeton Smith, class of 1979.
Here.
Mary Catherine Williams, class of 1979.
Here.
Dr. James C. Winters, class of 1979.
Here.
David E. Woodruff, class of 1979.
Here.
Anne Elizabeth Abbott, class of 1980.
Here.
Deborah Thomason Maddox Cole, class of 1980.
Here.
Gary Eugene Conklin, class of 1980.
Here.
Sandra Ann Eubank, class of 1980.
Here.
Dave Doyle Ferguson Jr., class of 1980.
Here.
Chester J. Fields, class of 1980.
Here.
Sergio Jesus Garibay, class of 1980.
Here.
James A. Horde, class of 1980.
Here.
William J. Kimes, class of 1980.
Here.
Sally Ann Kirk, class of 1980.
Here.
Mel Mertens, class of 1980.
Here.
Lloyd M. Nakayama, class of 1980.
Here.
Dr. Michael Joseph Quick, class of 1980.
Here.
Beth Annette Shirtliff, class of 1980.
Here.
Elaine Lindemann Smith, class of 1980.
Here.
James William Summerlin, class of 1980.
Here.
Edward Joseph Tatum, class of 1980.
Here.
Dr. Drew Neely Ware, class of 1980.
Here.
Jeffrey Keith Zimmerman, class of 1980.
Here.
Robert R. Adudel, class of 1981.
Here.
Stephen Allen Burton, class of 1981.
Here.
Robert J. Colburn, class of 1981.
Here.
Kathleen Mary Davis, class of 1981.
Here.
Dr. Ronald Lee Dilley, class of 1981.
Here.
Barney C. Eldridge, class of 1981.
Here.
Diane Drayling Ferguson, class of 1981.
Here.
John Thomas Gordon III, class of 1981.
Here.
Charles W. Hatley, class of 1981.
Here.
R. Allen Hawrelak, class of 1981.
Here.
William Lawrence Keel, class of 1981.
Here.
Dr. Kenny R. Livengood, class of 1981.
Here.
Elizabeth Dwight Mueller, class of 1981.
Here.
Lisa Puckett Pesek, class of 1981.
Here.
Bruce Dean Rice, class of 1981.
Here.
Scott Mather Richards, class of 1981.
Here.
Colonel Samuel Iba Cyphers, Jr., class of 1981.
Here.
Julia Spinn, class of 1981.
Here.
Colonel Glenn T. Starnes, class of 1981.
Here.
Craig K. Strain, class of 1981.
Here.
Byron Neil Vandenberg, class of 1981.
Here.
Dr. Gregory John Wood, class of 1981.
Here.
Dr. Mary Lee Archer, class of 1982.
Here.
Lisa Gail Ball, class of 1982.
Here.
Jerry Wayne Clemens, class of 1982.
Here.
Sean Timothy Crowley, class of 1982.
Here.
Melvin K. Davis, Jr., class of 1982.
Here.
Catarino Diaz, class of 1982.
Here.
Shelley Ray Jenkins, class of 1982.
Here.
Jeffrey Robert Manis, class of 1982.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert W. Marshall, class of 1982.
Here.
Laura Dean Mooney, class of 1982.
Here.
Stephen L. Thielen, class of 1982.
Here.
Marcus Clay Tullis, class of 1982.
Here.
Elizabeth Galindo Walzell, class of 1982.
Here.
Ted Wayne Whaley, class of 1982.
Here.
Nathan Allen Whitener, class of 1982.
Here.
Alan M. York, class of 1982.
Here.
Colin Gordon Bates, class of 1983.
Here.
Captain Donald C. Brackett, class of 1983.
Here.
Gary E. David, class of 1983.
Here.
Dr. Laura Ann Forrest, class of 1983.
Here.
Jonathan L. Hackett, class of 1983.
Here.
Dr. Michael W. Harville, class of 1983.
Here.
Donald Bradford Hurley, class of 1983.
Here.
Marla Deanne Jones, class of 1983.
Here.
James Aidan Cornegie III, class of 1983.
Here.
Stephen Kyle Lilly, class of 1983.
Here.
Jimmy Don McCamey, class of 1983.
Here.
John Floyd Morris, class of 1983.
Here.
Virginia Wingo Pennington, class of 1983.
Here.
Karen B. Stott, class of 1983.
Here.
Roger A. Wint, class of 1983.
Here.
Dr. Susan Carla Babb, class of 1984.
Here.
Andrea Renee Berg, class of 1984.
Here.
William C. Bergdahl, class of 1984.
Here.
Leslie Ann Carr, class of 1984.
Here.
Pamela Susan Dovey, class of 1984.
Here.
Dr. Steve Sherman Schooler, class of 1984.
Here.
Dr. Robert W. Stokes, class of 1984.
Here.
Stuart F. Timbrell, class of 1984.
Here.
Dwight Winfred Wood, Jr., class of 1984.
Here.
B. Sean Ball, class of 1985.
Here.
George Teague Dugan, Jr., class of 1985.
Here.
Karen Lee Griffiths, class of 1985.
Here.
Deborah Ann Jessup, class of 1985.
Here.
Peter Robert Clay, class of 1985.
Here.
Oscar Levi Lewis, Jr., class of 1985.
Here.
Julie Janek Martin, class of 1985.
Here.
Alan Ray Midstarfer, class of 1985.
Here.
Carol Ann Pickens, class of 1985.
Here.
Martha Maureen Pollock, class of 1985.
Here.
George Lee Ramsey, Jr., class of 1985.
Here.
J. Rhett Rushing, class of 1985.
Here.
Richard Edward Sepulveda, class of 1985.
Here.
William Joseph Blake, class of 1986.
Here.
Stephen Craig Blanton, class of 1986.
Here.
Gerald Garcia, class of 1986.
Here.
Martin Wayne Jarzembek, class of 1986.
Here.
Stephen Thomas Pollock, class of 1986.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel John W. Pennycook, class of 1986.
Here.
Paul Michael Ramirez, class of 1986.
Here.
David K. Wolf, class of 1986.
Here.
Mary Jo Stange Wood, class of 1986.
Here.
Timothy John Gray, class of 1987.
Here.
Patrick J. Hirsch, class of 1987.
Here.
Alan Courtney Jones, class of 1987.
Here.
Anthony Richard Katara, Jr., class of 1987.
Here.
Philip Barry Long, class of 1987.
Here.
Angela Marie Matoka, class of 1987.
Here.
Tony Lane Null, class of 1987.
Here.
Sandra Margaret Osperstini, class of 1987.
Here.
Cynthia Mayer Rondini, class of 1987.
Here.
Cynthia Renee Shirley, class of 1987.
Here.
James Richard Smith, Jr., class of 1987.
Here.
Mark Jeffrey Snoffer, class of 1987.
Here.
Lorraine Ann Billiot, class of 1988.
Here.
Jana K. Boyle, class of 1988.
Here.
Dr. Nedward Thomas Davidson, class of 1988.
Here.
Elizabeth A. St. Romaine, class of 1988.
Here.
Randolph Morgan Trout, class of 1988.
Here.
Dr. Van A. Walker, class of 1988.
Here.
Dr. George John Spayanovich, Sr., class of 1989.
Here.
Kenneth Craig Miller, class of 1989.
Here.
Khalid Farouk Omar, class of 1989.
Here.
Linda Marie Rocha, class of 1989.
Here.
Scott A. Sodek, class of 1989.
Here.
Anne E. South, class of 1989.
Here.
Mark Wayne Sumi, class of 1989.
Here.
Branch L. Ward, class of 1989.
Here.
David V. Wilson II, class of 1989.
Here.
Samuel Zahar, class of 1989.
Here.
Christopher Todd Askew, class of 1990.
Here.
Dr. Osmond Brown, Jr., class of 1990.
Here.
Dr. Anthony Chenna,
class of 1990.
Here.
Steve Carl Dixon Jr., class of 1990.
Here.
Christine Laverne Dunnigan, class of 1990.
Here.
Carrie Dwayne Moore, class of 1990.
Here.
Dr. William Lee Richardson, class of 1990.
Here.
Bart Thomas Royal, class of 1990.
Here.
Jan Marie Trimmer, class of 1990.
Here.
Frederick Shannon Waddell, class of 1990.
Here.
Nancy K. Huffman Walden, class of 1990.
Here.
Andrew Kurt Abrahamson, class of 1991.
Here.
Dr. Kelly J. Bryant, class of 1991.
Here.
Leslie Matthews Carey, class of 1991.
Here.
Sandra Faith Kincannon, class of 1991.
Here.
Kyle Allen Knight, class of 1991.
Here.
Valerie A. Bradley, class of 1992.
Here.
James M. Brown, class of 1992.
Here.
Todd W. Carroll, class of 1992.
Here.
Dr. Larry Dean Cook II, class of 1992.
Here.
Dr. Hubert Darnell Glover, class of 1992.
Here.
Darren E. Hickman, class of 1992.
Here.
Jimmy L. McKee, class of 1992.
Here.
Coy Bright Shiner, class of 1992.
Here.
Dr. Michael J. Smolin, class of 1992.
Here.
Dr. Ravi Shand D. Valor, class of 1992.
Here.
Thomas Arthur Wilson, class of 1992.
Here.
Donald Leroy Atkinson, Jr., class of 1993.
Here.
Laura McKell Batten, class of 1993.
Here.
Paul Jonathan Brown, class of 1993.
Here.
Teresa Annette Eaton, class of 1993.
Here.
Dr. Chuanji He, class of 1993.
Here.
Professor John Joseph Knopf, Jr., class of 1993.
Here.
John William Robertson, Jr., class of 1993.
Here.
Connie Ann Smith, class of 1993.
Here.
Gregory D. Denby, class of 1994.
Here.
David Edwards, Jr., class of 1994.
Here.
John Kelly McWhorter, class of 1994.
Here.
Russell R. Mobley II, class of 1994.
Here.
William J. Rogers, class of 1994.
Here.
Thomas Hilton Wiedemeyer, class of 1994.
Here.
John Clark Williams, class of 1994.
Here.
Beverly Reynolds Bame, class of 1995.
Here.
Derek Wayne Griffith, class of 1995.
Here.
Melissa Marie Wooldridge James, class of 1995.
Here.
James Everett Kirk, class of 1995.
Here.
Dr. Hang Shin Lin, class of 1995.
Here.
Matthew Hamilton Grant, class of 1996.
Here.
Brian L. Johnson, class of 1996.
Here.
Catherine Grace King, class of 1996.
Here.
Leslie Michelle McKenzie, class of 1996.
Here.
Dr. John William Moore, class of 1996.
Here.
Dr. Richard Ihizoji Okolowise, class of 1996.
Here.
Michael Wells, class of 1996.
Here.
Laramie Lynn Wingate, class of 1996.
Here.
Dr. James Clifford Airy, class of 1997.
Here.
Thomas J. Avery, class of 1997.
Here.
Dr. George Francis Carter Jr., class of 1997.
Here.
Leopold Chavez, class of 1997.
Here.
George Leonard Hesketh Jr., class of 1997.
Here.
Daniel Albert Holtzman, class of 1997.
Here.
Elgin Johnson, class of 1997.
Here.
Rajiv Kumar Rumala, class of 1997.
Here.
Mark A. Smith, class of 1997.
Here.
Valentina Sunday, class of 1997.
Here.
Linda Jean Bowe, class of 1998.
Here.
Landon Wayne Cowles, class of 1998.
Here.
Charles Edward Ferguson, the fourth, class of 1998.
Here.
Sharina Nicole Hightower, class of 1998.
Here.
Rose A. Wells, class of 1998.
Here.
Charles Lee Doherty, class of 1999.
Here.
Dr. Daniel Lewis Gentry, class of 1999.
Here.
Marcus Ortiz, class of 1999.
Here.
Dr. James Henry Smith, class of 1999.
Here.
Anne Marie Hamilton, class of 2000.
Here.
Leslie Michelle Herlocker, class of 2000.
Here.
Mark Robert Valvo, class of 2000.
Here.
Christopher Roderick Bryant, class of 2001.
Here.
Sarah Catherine Durkowski, class of 2001.
Here.
Michelle Grace Interline, class of 2001.
Here.
Adam Brian Gentle, class of 2001.
Here.
Jamie Lee Hendrickson, class of 2001.
Here.
William R. Ingersoll, class of 2001.
Here.
Kelly Sue Harrell Mata, class of 2001.
Here.
Brandon David Renfro, class of 2001.
Here.
Dr. Brian Lee Slovan, class of 2001.
Here.
Joseph M. Harmon, class of 2002.
Here.
Dustin Chase Havard, class of 2002.
Here.
Angelique Giselle Montez Gamard, class of 2002.
Here.
Catherine Elizabeth Broyles Nance, class of 2002.
Here.
Heidi J. E. Sivrud Davenport, class of 2002.
Here.
Joe Brooks White II, class of 2002.
Here.
Bradley Dale Childs, class of 2003.
Here.
Leah Compton Eason, class of 2003.
Here.
Dr. Susan Simpson Hull, class of 2003.
Here.
Gregory Scott Jordan, class of 2003.
Here.
Kathleen Ann Terry, class of 2003.
Here.
Clayton Walker Williams, class of 2003.
Here.
Megan Keedy Rothwell, class of 2004.
Here.
Michael Austin Fisk, class of 2005.
Here.
Anthony David Luce, class of 2005.
Here.
Donna Bates Price, class of 2005.
Here.
Melissa Ann Estes, class of 2006.
Here.
Michael Wayne Miller, class of 2006.
Here.
William Stanton Barlow, class of 2007.
Here.
Marty Suzanne Fleming, class of 2007.
Here.
Ryan Barrett Fogel, class of 2008.
Here.
Shondi Lee Sellers, class of 2008.
Here.
Dr. Adrian Danielle DeHood Fritz, class of 2009.
Here.
Dr. Susan Marie Vidoc, class of 2009.
Here.
Peter Joseph Simeon III, class of 2009.
Here.
Ryan Henry Beseda, class of 2010.
Here.
Catherine Leanne Brown, class of 2010.
Here.
Glenda Haygood Dennison, class of 2010.
Here.
Stephen Kirsten Dunny, class of 2010.
Here.
Dr. Sarah Victoria Luna, class of 2010.
Here.
Chong Than Go, class of 2010.
Here.
Jared Michael Reeves, class of 2010.
Here.
Polina Valentinovna Rowland, class of 2011.
Here.
Donna Faye Verna, class of 2012.
Here.
Megan Jeanette Dudley, class of 2013.
Here.
Brian Kevin Gum II, class of 2013.
Here.
Matthew Manuel Louise, class of 2013.
Here.
Barry Lynn Smith, class of 2013.
Here.
Garrett Patrick Vandergritten, class of 2013.
Here.
Kevin Randolph Sawyer, class of 2014.
Here.
Gerald Charles Gilbert, class of 2015.
Here.
Travis Culberson Gray, class of 2015.
Here.
Dr. Javier Andres Sands II, class of 2015.
Here.
Jason Pervez Zaki, class of 2015.
Here.
Michael Paul Davidson, class of 2016.
Here.
Megan Dawn Hooker, class of 2016.
Here.
Chude Valentine Okugwa, class of 2016.
Here.
Samantha Christine Shopey, class of 2016.
Here.
Dr. Linda Cummins West, class of 2017.
Here.
Cody Carl Briggs Jr., class of 2018.
Here.
Bailey Nicole Brownwell, class of 2018.
Here.
Gregory Scott Schooley III, class of 2018.
Here.
Zachary Dylan Smith, class of 2018.
Here.
Evan Grant Andrews, class of 2019.
Here.
Andrew Evan Brightwell, class of 2019.
Here.
Jonas Charles Calhoun, class of 2019.
Here.
Raymond Donovan Martinez, class of 2019.
Here.
Nathan Wesley Matos, class of 2019.
Here.
John Adrian Perot, class of 2019.
Here.
Aaron Davis Raymond, class of 2019.
Here.
Megan Ellen Sanders, class of 2019.
Here.
Stephanie Ray Waitzel, class of 2019.
Here.
Vladimir N. Yelkamov, class of 2019.
Here.
William Zachary Elder, class of 2020.
Here.
Enrique Elizondo Jr., class of 2020.
Here.
Luke Raphael Laffenberg, class of 2020.
Here.
Cameron Christopher McNeff, class of 2020.
Here.
Jedediah Tuedo Talome, class of 2020.
Here.
Roberto Arturo Acosta, class of 2020.
Here.
Yvette Ann Barbier, class of 2021.
Here.
Carlin Nicole Beatty, class of 2022.
Here.
Wesley Donald Sanders, class of 2022.
Here.
Stephen Devin Anderson, class of 2020.
Here. Here.
Roberto Arturo Acosta, class of 2021.
Here. Here.
Roel Israel Prado, class of 2021.
Here.
Here.
Nicholas Joseph King, class of 2022.
Here.
Eric Alexander Medina, class of 2022.
Here.
Leela Justine Burney, class of 2023.
Here. Here.
Vincent Bell Hughes Jr., class of 1943.
Here.
Cosmo Frank Guido, class of 1944.
Here.
William George Johnson Jr., class of 1945.
Here.
Dr. Benjamin Mosier, class of 1947.
Here. Here.
Beverly Eugene Brown, class of 1948.
Here. Here.
Charles W. Davis II, class of 1950.
Here.
Here. Dr. James H. Lamp, class of 1950.
Here.
Dr. Chester Ward Studdard, class of 1950.
Here.
James Shelby Newman, class of 1952.
Here.
Here.
John Olin Patrick, class
Here.
Holloway J. Martin Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
Lawrence M. Whaley, class of 1953.
Here. Bartlett Blanford Holland, class of 1955.
Here.
Juan Garza, class of 1956.
Here.
Paul Eugene Harrison, class of 1956.
Here.
Jean L. Wismer, class of 1957.
Here. Nolan H. Gotcher, class of 1958.
Here.
Richard Earl Damon, class of 1960.
Here.
William Earl Crump III, class of 1961.
Here.
Lawrence Robert Gardner, class of 1962.
Here.
Brian Kyle Grammer, class of 1963.
Here.
Dr. Ronald Aaron LaFleur, Sr., class of 1963.
Here.
Kenneth Douglas Abendroth, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Rodney G. Lee, class of 1965.
Here.
Manuel I. Cruz, class of 1968.
Here.
William Rodriguez, Sr., class of 1968.
Here.
Thomas Lee Gailey, class of 1970.
Here.
Brian Joseph Wicker, class of 1971.
Here.
Dennis Lee Zwernerman, class of 1971.
Here.
Larry T. Lamb, class of 1972.
Here.
Christopher James Kling, class of 1973.
Here.
Barbara B. McKnight, class of 1973.
Here.
Eduardo Lozano Pena, class of 1973.
Here.
Stephen T. Johnson, class of 1974.
Here.
Gatlin William Edwards II, class of 1976.
Here.
Larry J. Smithwick, class of 1976.
Here.
Jose Federico Apostola, class of 1978.
Here.
James Glenn Grant, Jr., class of 1978.
Here.
Aaron Lee Schulz, class of 1979.
Here.
Diane Cherie Daring Sheggett, class of 1979.
Here.
Phyllis K. Vincent, class of 1979.
Here.
David W. Bergen, class of 1980.
Here.
James Dale Jordan, class of 1980.
Here.
James H. Prestige, Jr., class of 1980. Here. John Eldred Kozad, class of 1981.
Here.
Louis E. Bushnut, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Clayton Eugene Massey, class of 1983.
Here.
Mark Frederick Dasky, class of 1988.
Here.
Lieutenant Commander Dennis Lee Hasman, class of 1988.
Here.
Craig Allen Erickson, class of 1989.
Here.
Michael A. Durda, class of 1990.
Here.
Kyle Jackson Blake, class of 1991.
Here.
Douglas Edwin Bump, class of 1991.
Here.
Chris J. Yannick, class of 1991.
Here.
Dr. Christos Nicholas Macrogeorges, class of 1991.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James Thomas Rich, class of 1992.
Here.
Derek G. Thom, class of 1992.
Here.
Dr. Charles Wayne Gillespie, class of 1993.
Here.
Dr. Michael J. Bishop, class of 1995.
Here. Dr. Muhammad Amran, class of 1995.
Here.
Bryce Taylor Kirby, class of 1997.
Here.
Charles Patrick Moore, class of 1997.
Here.
William Edward Lawrence Easterwood, class of 1998.
Here.
Sabin Bo Steinbacher, class of 2004.
Here.
Mark William Carricker, class class of 2010.
Here.
Here.
Laura Louise Coyne, class of 2011.
Here.
Dr. Justin Brandt Dickerson, class of 2012.
Here.
Lauren Michael Morgan, class of 2013.
Here.
Here. Carol Jean Whitaker Cantrell.
Here.
Dr. William Hyman.
Here.
Dr. James C. Hugh.
Here.
Here.
Dr. John Joseph Coldis III.
Here.
Dr. William Hodges Mobley.
Here.
Dr. Lloyd William Rooney.
Here.
Dr. Manuel Soriaga.
Here.
Samuel A. Relifs, class of 1930.
Here.
Dr. Rudolph Edward Scheffelbein, class of 1946.
Here.
Joseph Edward Plume, class of 1947.
Here.
Pete L. Scamardo, class of 1947.
Here.
William C. Cowan, class of 1949.
Here.
James Hervey Morris III, class of 1949.
Here.
John Taylor Hutchin, Jr., class of 1949.
Here.
Robert Eldred Ferguson, class of 1950.
Here.
William A. Galbraith, class of 1950.
Here.
Dr. Robert Bernard Krause, class of 1950.
Here.
Elwin Drunell Havard, class of 1952.
Here.
Thomas Gale Mabray, class of 1952.
Here.
Dr. Francis Trudeau Caziou, class of 1955.
Here.
Robert William Beatty, class of 1955.
Here.
Dr. Schley Bruce Walker, class of 1955.
Here.
Roy Lee Engermiller, class of 1960.
Here.
Shelton R. Dirksen, Jr., class of 1960.
Here.
Raymond Edwin Bridges, class of 1962.
Here.
Colonel Grange Simons Coffin, Jr., class of 1962.
Here.
Captain Carl Winston List, class of 1962.
Here.
Lucius Earl Jones, class of 1964.
Here.
Colonel John Berkson Woodall, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. Larry Paul Thornburg, class of 1969.
Here.
Robert Clint Bratcher, class of 1970.
Here.
Louis Bob Yaska, class of 1941.
Here.
Harold Beverly Lord, class of 1942.
Here.
James Walter Mendel, class of 1942.
Here.
Durward M. Staten, Jr., class of 1945.
Here.
Mortimer Leonard Mertz, class of 1945.
Here.
Harry D. Comale, class of 1946.
Here.
James Earl Mankins, Sr., class of 1947.
Here.
William A. Galbraith, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Henry Wetzel, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Colonel Jean D. Tarbutton, class of 1950.
Here.
William Alfred Vahan, Sr., class of 1950.
Here.
Merle Arnold Prokop, Jr., class of 1950.
Here.
Elmore Rule Torn, Jr., class of 1952.
Here.
Alan Roland Black, Jr., class of 1953.
Here.
Edwin Edward Forsaggy, Jr., class of 1955.
Here.
James Edward Ayers, class of 1959.
Here.
Hugh Edward McCarley, class of 1959.
Here.
Lyndon Boyd Robertson, class of 1959.
Here.
Duncan Cicero Covington, class of 1961.
Here.
Johnny A. Dorodic, class of 1962.
Here.
Colonel Harold Winford Rainey, class of 1963.
Here.
Colonel John Burleson Woodall, class of 1964.
Here.
Dr. James Charles Schlinke, class of 1966.
Here.
Lieutenant Colonel James T. Trammell, class of 1966.
Here.
John Ross Kuiper, class of 1968.
Here.
Ricardo Olivares, class of 1968.
Here.
Donald S. Lewis, Jr., class of 1969.
Here.
Anthony Lee Jones, class of 1970.
Here.
Dr. Norma Nell Fabian, class of 1971.
Here.
Cosmo Frank Guido, class of 1944.
Here.
Herbert L. Brammer, class of 1945.
Here.
Jack Bethea Crawford, class of 1945.
Here.
William George Johnson, Jr., class of 1945.
Here.
John Olin Patrick, class of 1952.
Here.
Clyde A. Two, class of 1959.
Here.
Mark Wayne Whiteley, class of 1971.
Here.
Sedgwick Bryant Lloyd II, class of 1972.
Here.
Dr. Charles John Gruey, Jr., class of 1973.
Here.
Thomas Joseph Pisclack, class of 1973.
Here.
Manaf M. Hamoudi, class of 1974.
Here.
John Robert Leidner, class of 1974.
Here.
Regina Roaming Pisenchik, class of 1974.
Here.
Dr. Amelia Cirillo, class of 1975.
Here.
Robert Clyde Rao, class of 1975.
Here.
Jimmy Allen Riggs, class of 1975.
Here.
Vicente A. Shields, class of 1975.
Here.
Julio Samuel Mancias, class of 1976.
Here.
Manuel J. Rivas, class of 1977.
Here.
Marilyn K. Rawlings, class of 1977.
Here.
Louis Joseph Ciocchetto, class of 1978.
Here.
Dr. Carrie R. Livingood, class of 1981.
Here.
Elizabeth Galindo Walzel, class of 1982.
Here.
James Alden Cornegay III, class of 1983.
Here.
Andrea Renee Berg, class of 1984.
Here.
Sandra Margaret Opperstini, class of 1987.
Here.
Ryan Henry Becerra, class of 2010.
Here.
Dr. Javier Andres Saenz II, class of 2015.
Here.
Samantha Christine Shoppy, class of 2016.
Here.
Bailey Nicole Brownell, class of 2018.
Here.
Jedediah Tuedio Talom, class of 2020.
Here.
In Memoriam by Lieutenant Colonel David Harrigan, class of 1968. We stood a little taller and a little prouder then when we heard the call of muster and the roll call just begin. We stood there all together and wiped away the tears when our names were called out softly and answered with a here. And so we've joined together with our brothers of the past to make our final resting place at Aggieland our last. We take a toast to our brotherhood wherever they may roam. For us, the trek is over. Aggieland, we're coming home.
Aggies, the 2020 worldwide roll call for the absent is now complete. On this most unusual muster day, the Association of Former Students reminds Aggies everywhere that what matters is not how we muster, but that we muster. So whether you celebrate this muster day with the friends and family beside you or online at musterlive.aggienetwork.com, remember that this is a time to live over the days we spent at Texas A&M and to honor all of our fellow Aggies who have been taken from our side, but whose memories live on in our hearts. Thanks and gig 'em, Aggies, and until we are in each other's company once again, may all of our lives be filled with the spirit of Aggieland.
Some may boast of prowess bold, of the school they think so grand,
but there's a spirit can ne'er be told.
It's the spirit of Aggieland.
We are the Aggies are we. True to each other as Aggies can be.
We've got to fight, boys, we've got to fight.
We've got to fight for maroon and white. After they boosted all the rest,
Then they will come and join the best.
for we are the Aggies are we.